Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Deborah Patori-Ferrand, and I am the Executive Director of CCIU, the Connecticut Council for Interreligious Understanding. Welcome to this evening's program, War in the Orthodox Church, a conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Peter Smith of the Associated Press. For those of you not familiar with CCIU, we're a nonprofit organization that promotes interfaith dialogue and understanding in order to achieve mutual respect, justice, and peace. I hope that you'll visit our website, www.ccfiu.org, to find out more about our work. And with the help of supporters like many of you, we're able to offer unique programs like this. We're talking tonight about the relationship between the war in Ukraine and the Orthodox Church. But I want to take a moment to note that our thoughts tonight are with the people of Ukraine and everyone affected by the tragedy that's unfolding in the region. I know you share our concerns and prayers for a swift and just resolution to this senseless war. And now I'd like to introduce this evening's speaker. Tonight we're honored to have as our guest noted reporter Peter Smith, who covers religion and politics for the Associated Press. Peter has covered religion for more than 25 years. He is the immediate past president of the Religion News Association. He has received numerous awards, including a Pulitzer finalist in 2020 and the Pulitzer Prize in 2019 as part of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette team for coverage of the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre. He's a native of Connecticut who got his start at local papers in Shelton and Naugatuck. And over the past weeks, Peter has covered many aspects of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and Russia, and his widely circulated article, How is the Russia-Ukraine War Linked to Religion?, has been a go-to reference for understanding the religious underpinnings of the conflict. Peter, welcome and thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
So, as you know, the history of the Orthodox Church in Russia and Ukraine is complicated. So I wanted to start with some basic background information about religion in the region for those in the audience who might not be that well versed in the subject. So let's start off. Can you tell us a little bit about the religious makeup of the people of Ukraine?
Yeah, certainly. So Ukraine, it's a large country, more than 40 million or so. The large majority are identify as Orthodox Christian. Now, surveys are harder to come by, in terms of strictly reliable data there, but the surveys generally say, anywhere from close to 2/3 to 3/4. A good 1/10 or so are Ukrainian Catholic, and later on I'll get into some of the distinction. There are also Roman Catholics there. They're all Catholic, but the Roman Catholic is a much smaller group. There is a significant secular minority there as well as in other countries, both in Europe and of course our own country, and a pretty diverse group of smaller religious minorities as well. There's a Jewish population that has been there since medieval times, a Muslim population, and various Protestant groups. For example, the Baptist population in Ukraine is the second largest in Europe to Britain.
Wow. And so the majority of religious Ukrainians are members of the Orthodox Church. So for those of us not that familiar with Eastern Orthodoxy, what are the distinguishing features of that faith?
Well, for those who do know Orthodoxy, that's going to be hard to summarize, but I'll do a few. It's an ancient faith. They trace their roots right back to the original church at Pentecost. They consider themselves an apostolic church in that their bishops are all in an unbroken line going back to the original apostles. So it is rooted in the ancient creeds, ancient decrees of the councils of the church, all of which are shared by the Catholic Church. These apostolic succession, the ancient creeds, the ancient councils. In fact, I was trying to think of how do I tie in a talk about Orthodoxy with St. Patrick's Day. I was actually interviewing an Orthodox priest here in Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh has a rich diversity of Orthodox churches as a legacy of immigration. And the priest's name was Patrick. And he said he chose that name. And I said, oh, is he a saint in the Orthodox Church too? And he said, yes, every saint from before the schism is a saint in both the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. So what happened was that, the Roman Empire split. Western Europe, sort of history went in one direction there and another direction in Eastern Europe. The Empire survived another 1,000 years. So culturally, they were coming apart. They began to have a doctrinal disagreement over the wording of the creed, and finally, and over authority, because the Pope asserted universal authority. And so they ended up having a schism in 1054 that was never healed. And I think the last thing I would say is, even there are many similarities in terms of sacramental theology and other theology. But if you go to an Orthodox service, I mean, it will make it. If you think a Catholic Church service is ritualistic and liturgical, it looks like a Quaker meeting compared to the Divine Liturgy.
So, if you kind of think of each of these, right? So there's the Russian Orthodox Church, et cetera. How many distinct Orthodox churches are there in the world? And is there like a hierarchy like the Catholic Church, or are they essentially independent of each other?
Well, it's not like the Catholic Church in that there is no Pope. There are certainly, and so there is that similarity, but there's an ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, Turkey, who by virtue of being in the imperial seat of the Byzantine Empire was considered and still is considered first among equals, even though there are not that many Orthodox in Turkey anymore. But there are patriarchs in similar positions in various churches. And it has evolved over time that they all work together at a very high level. They share the creeds and the sacraments. So if you're from one church, you can go to another Eastern Orthodox church. They're mostly organized around the national lines of the historic, like ancient churches in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. So if you keep score, there are 14 completely independent churches where the patriarchs are considered on an equal plane. And if they were ever to make any momentous changes, they're all supposed to agree on it in council or in synod. And there are various other churches that are mostly autonomous or at various degrees of autonomy. So when you started having immigration out of the traditional Orthodox world into the United States and other parts of the world, most of those churches answer back to one or another of the patriarchs of the historic churches.
Okay, that's helpful. And so again, now in Ukraine, there are two Orthodox churches, right? There's one that's Kyiv-based and one affiliated with Moscow. How did that come to be? Can you give us a little bit background of why there are two Orthodox churches in Ukraine?
Well, the reason there's two is that they whittled it down from three.
Okay.
Well, that's the short answer. So the long answer goes back 1,000 years. And to Kievan Rus, which was, excuse me, I've got a scratchy throat here. There was a medieval kingdom based in Kiev, led by Prince Vladimir, and it was an up-and-coming state. It was a thriving power in the region. And Prince Vladimir in the 10th century adopted Orthodoxy as his religion, and then he had his own soldiers and others baptized. So he was baptized in Crimea. So there's a shrine there to where that momentous conversion that ended up leading to the conversion of the whole country. Then he went back to Kiev, and where he had many others baptized there. So this will come up because just a quick fast forward, and then I'll zoom back, as like Putin and others would speak of Crimea as a holy land. And so in addition to whatever geopolitical reasons there were for seizing it, there were also some religious reasons. And you also hear both countries talk about having their roots in the the Kievan baptismal font.
Hmm.
Sometimes they'll name the river Dnieper. So that's where it started. So over time, the Kievan part of the kingdom waned and started to be, other empires started nibbling away at it. Moscow started gaining power. And so the center of gravity moved to Moscow. And so the Russian Empire was growing. And at the same time, Constantinople fell to the Turks, and so they were more beleaguered. And so in I believe it was 1686, I'm just glancing at notes over here, the Patriarch of Constantinople delegated to the Patriarch of Moscow the ordination of the bishop or the metropolitan, which is like an archbishop of Kiev. So the question that still is debated to this day is, was that temporary or permanent? So those who say it was permanent say, no, he delegated it. It's there in writing. And others will say, yeah, but he said it was because of the current circumstances. There were wars going on. It was hard to maintain communication and everything. So, but ever since then, the church in Ukraine has been governed, at least at a high level, by the Patriarch. Now, it has always had by the Patriarch of Moscow. Now, it's always had a high degree of autonomy, which will come into play this year as well. But there is that ultimate loyalty now to the Moscow Patriarch as opposed to the ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople. And so that sort of sets the table. Now, going back 100 years ago, when Ukraine first got its independence, when the Russian Empire, when the Tsar fell to the Bolsheviks, Ukraine had a brief moment of independence, and almost immediately you had some Orthodox there saying, we want our own independent church. We want to be in an equal par with those other 14 churches. And pretty soon the communists retook Ukraine and suppressed that church, went underground for about 80 years. And then after independence in 1990, that church reemerged saying, okay, independent again. Now let's get our independent church going again. And just to make things more complicated, another group of Orthodox said, oh, yeah, we want an independent church too, but we're going to start our own from scratch here. So, but neither of them had recognition from anyone else. So Moscow would say, well, they're just in schism. They're not part of, they don't have any standing, all of which stood right up until 2018, in 2019, when the Patriarch of Constantinople said, you know that thing that my predecessor did back in 1686? Well, that was only temporary, and I'm taking over again. And in my newly reasserted authority, I'm granting independence to, the technical term is autocephaly or self-headedness, granting independence. I'm going to merge these two churches together. He basically got them in a room and said, you work out your differences, put it together, make one church, I'll grant you independence. And that happened. And of course, the Patriarch of Moscow threw a fit, said, this is completely divisive, to the point where he said, Moscow said, we're out of communion with you, which is huge, because that's the one thing the Orthodox, have, even though they're different national churches, they're supposed to be able to take communion together. And he's saying, no, we cannot do that anymore.
So now in Ukraine, there's essentially the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is Moscow affiliated.
Correct.
If I got this straight. And then the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, yes, which is the church you were just, the autocephalous church that was just granted by Constantinople. Are those two churches very different from one another in terms of either like theology or liturgy?
Something I should have said up front is I have never been to Ukraine. So what I know is from covering Orthodox here, covering it some abroad, but talking to experts, reading, and all that. So that's a big caveat to everything here. Sure. But my understanding is there's no difference. And if for those who have gone to seminary, you hear the difference. What's the difference between a schism and a heresy? And heresy is a difference over teaching. Schism is a difference over leadership. And often they end up merging, but that hasn't been asserted here at all. That the whole issue here has been an issue of who is the rightful leader. They share the same creed, same rituals. There may be some minor differences in the rituals, but for the most part, no.
Okay. And I know we said we're going to talk about the war. I just want a couple more questions just to kind of, so we understand exactly what's going on prior to the invasion and how that's thrown everything into an additional, kind of chaos. How, prior to the war, prior to Russia's attack on Ukraine, how would you characterize the relationship between those two Ukrainian churches, right? So Moscow, very unhappy about granting autonomy to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Within Ukraine, what was the relationship like between those two churches?
My understanding, it was very frosty.
Frosty. Okay.
Now, my understanding, it's a big country and maybe varied by region. There were certainly, I've heard there were more disputes in the East, which is the more, Russian influenced part of the country, over, okay, which group gets to control which church anymore. There really isn't a mechanism. I mean, it's hard enough here, we've got hundreds of years of church state law that says, okay, if there's a dispute over a church, like who owns a building, how do we solve this in the courts? But there really isn't that case law in Ukraine. So there were some disputes over that. I don't know how many and how pervasive that was. Often, there are many villages where there's only one church anyway.
Right. So kind of my next question is, like, let's say in a city like Kyiv, so the physical map, right, on the ground, would it be unusual to see a church belonging to kind of the Moscow-based Orthodox Church and a church representing the Kyiv Orthodox Church in the same city?
Yes. It would not be unusual. That would be very common. So in Kyiv, each one has a cathedral in Kyiv.
Okay.
So I don't think that would be unusual at all. I mean, and I should point out what's interesting is, even though as big a deal as this new autocephalous church was, a lot of churches, and no one can do a survey to figure out exactly how many, but a huge number of churches remained in the Moscow Patriarchate. So they never wanted to leave. They wanted to be part of the church as it was, which, as I said, is loyal to Moscow, but has always had a lot of autonomy.
So before the invasion, just to go back to that point, actually, so Kyiv is a big city, and obviously when you get to the villages, there might only be one church, but in some medium-sized cities, there could be churches from both camps, if you will, as well. Okay, so the average Ukrainian, and again, before the invasion, the average Ukrainian who's worshiping in their local Orthodox church, are they thinking much about whether or not it's under the auspices of Moscow or Kyiv, or is it just their church?
From what I've heard, it often that they may not know, or if they do know, it may not be the priority. It might be, this will sound familiar to Americans, that it might be just that they like the priest or they like the location or something. But my understanding is that often sometimes at least these debates did kind of filter in so that it did become important, whether, particularly as the tensions ramped up
right
in advance of the war. One thing I forgot to mention is there's a council of churches and religious organizations in Ukraine. So it's kind of like if you combine an ecumenical and an interfaith group into one. Both of the Orthodox churches were involved with that. So they did on some level talk and have some dialogue.
Okay. Today, and I know that for the most part, people in Ukraine are worried about, kind of their lives and sovereignty and safety. But now, is there a sense, is there a growing allegiance to one church or the other in Ukraine? How has the war kind of, again, if I'm an individual that belongs to one of these two churches, has the war, based on your reporting, changed how I feel? Am I less unaware maybe of the difference?
Well, this is the really interesting thing, is from the moment the war started, there was fierce opposition to the war from all sides, including the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, which is very indigenously Ukrainian. It's people are from Ukraine. They are with the increasing use of the Ukrainian language, most of them are trained in Ukrainian as opposed to Russian. They identify very much as Ukrainian, and they viewed the assault by Russia on their country as an assault by a foreign country on their country. They immediately, from the top bishop Onufri, the Metropolitan Onufri, all the way down, there was constant appeals, appealing to the Patriarch of Moscow, use your influence to stop this. There has been talk in some eparchies, dioceses, of priests actually wanting independence. Now, interestingly, they haven't said we want to join the other side, the other team, but they just said we want independence on our own. Again, it's a hot war. Nobody is working out the details of a ecclesiastical break, but I think if they were taking a more pro-Moscow stance, which is hard to imagine, that might have caused more people to say, well, I want to go to the other church. But given that they are both taking such a strong stand against the invasion, that I have not heard of that being a factor. And again, I'm here, I'm not there, so that was a huge grain of salt.
So what about the reaction among the global leadership of the Orthodox Church? What has that been like? And what has been the reaction of the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church? Well, I'm sorry to ask, see, I'm not a good reporter. I should be on the other side of this, but I'll start with the first question, which is, what's the reaction been of the global leadership of the Orthodox Church?
I probably should back up a little bit and talk about how that battle between between the patriarchs of Moscow and the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, and battle's not the right word, but it's a real breach, spilled over even before the war. And this will get to the answer shortly, but spilled over. It was a very tense thing. Normally, if there's going to be a big change in the Orthodox world, they're all supposed to come together and agree on it, and it's hard to get them together. Actually, they tried to do that a few years ago, and it didn't happen. And the last time they did that was the Second Council of Nicaea about 1,200 years ago. So it's hard to get this sort of thing done. But some of the patriarchs, a few of them, mostly in the Greek sphere of our orthodoxy, went along with the ecumenical patriarchs' recognition of the Ukrainian church. So they said, we recognize the Ukrainian church too, including the Patriarch of Alexandria, whose territory is Africa. And lo and behold, then Russia said, you know what, we're going to set up our own jurisdiction in Africa. So the Russian Orthodox Church now has a separate, it's called an exarchy, I believe. And so that division has already gone global in a way. A lot of other churches have just kept very quiet about it. And I don't have a full running count, but the reactions to the war have been pretty much along those same lines. So the ecumenical patriarch has denounced it in the strongest possible terms, as have some other churches that are under his jurisdiction.
And what about what has the reaction been among priests within the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia? Have they been, I know the patriarch, there's been a lot of conversation, we can get to that, about his role, but in terms of the priests within individual parishes, if you will, what has been their reaction, if any?
That's an excellent question. I wish I knew more. It's hard. I mean, the Russian crackdown on media is so severe now that it's hard to know what's going on in Russia. Mm-hmm. We do know that there were about 300 Russian Orthodox priests, most of them in Russia, a few of them based in like church expatriate churches outside of Russia, who signed a letter which it was very cautiously worded, but it clearly called on Russia to stop the war. Now that's 300 priests compared with what, 15,000 or so.
Right.
So it's a small minority, but it took some courage for them to even say that much, and it was a very cautiously worded statement because, you know, they could be putting themselves at some risk.
Right.
It's hard to know.
Right. So, you know, thinking about that, I also know that, I guess I read that some Orthodox churches have, so let's talk about the Patriarch Kirill and his role in all of this. Can you talk a little bit about kind of his role, and it's gotten a lot of press lately because it seems somewhat political, but can you just talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Patriarch Kirill was already viewed as a very strong ally of President Putin, and he put forth a vision which is not just his, but he certainly is a prominent proponent of it, called the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which is basically it's not quite the same as the former Soviet Union, but it's more of a kind of pan-Eastern Slavic world of you know, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russian-speaking peoples in the borderlands around, all sharing a common civilizational ethos and values, even if they're not all saints themselves, that they're all sort of part of one kind of spiritual nation in a way.
And not to interrupt you, but doesn't that go back to kind of the geography of Kievan Rus, which you?
Yes. So, you know, over the centuries, Kievan Rus, you know, Ukrainians said, you know, over the centuries, we've kind of become our own country, you become yours. Yes, we're related, but we're not the same. And whereas Russia has said we've always been the same. And that's been a debate that, you know, each side can point to different points in history of when they were either more together or more apart. Mm-hmm. So laying the groundwork, you know, Patriarch Kirill has always had this view of the Russian world. So that's part of the reason why his reaction was so strong to the ecumenical patriarch granting that independence to the Ukrainian church, because, you know, first of all, legally, your predecessor gave that up hundreds of years ago, he said, and so he, you know, this is, I mean, the way he put it was, not only was the ecumenical patriarch sowing enmity between peoples that are supposed to be together, it's like he's in on this, but he says it wasn't just them. He also blamed the West, the United States and Western Europe, EU, NATO, for being all part of that same project. You certainly can hear, like, the Russian foreign minister has outright said that the U.S. put him up to it. So the U.S. this was the U.S. doing it. The U.S. pressured the Patriarch of Constantinople to break up the church because for geopolitical reasons. So it's, as you may know, that the law in Russia has been, you know, we don't refer to this as a war. However, Patriarch Kirill has continued to make statements completely underscoring the narrative that Putin gave in justifying the war, which is this is one people and they're after us. You know, in fact, Putin even said they're trying to exterminate our Orthodox Church there. Kirill has said various things, including, you know, one of the things that caught the most headlines was what we're faced with is a metaphysical war. We've got the West that is trying to put pressure on everyone. If you want to join, be lured by the material prosperity and liberalism of their war, you have to do something to show your loyalty to the West, to the liberal agenda. You have to hold a gay pride parade.
Right. That was the litmus test you needed to.
That was the litmus test. Yeah. Right. So these are ways in which he has, without outright mentioning there's a war going on, has bolstered the Russian justification for the war.
Right. And I know, I know the Pope has met with him recently. I guess a video meeting.
Spoke with him. Yeah, by video. Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, there the outcry among the Orthodox Church, the various people. I know. I guess I read that that there are certain clerics that are refusing to commemorate him during the liturgy. They're usually, my understanding is that in a service they'll kind of talk about saints and the patriarch and metropolitans, and he's been kind of crossed out of that. What's the significance of that? Is that a big deal for churches?
Yeah, it is. It sounds like a little deal, doesn't it? But I've been trying to think of what's a good analogy, and I guess maybe at a wedding or a funeral, when you're paying tribute to all the people that have contributed to this couple, this life, and you leave out one of the parents.
Okay.
So how does that feel? Is that just a few extra words? So that's some indication. The Orthodox Church basically, to be in communion with the church, by definition, you need to be in communion with a church that's under a bishop who is a successor to the apostles. They are the visible symbol of the unity of the church. And if you're out of communion with them, you're out of the church, essentially. And so if you're not mentioning patriarch, what you're basically saying is we no longer see you as a guarantor of the unity of the church. We see ourselves as in the church in some other way. I don't think I'm speaking too far out of turn. Theologically it gets a little complex, but it's a big deal. And this is happening in Orthodox Church, in Ukraine, Orthodox churches belonging to the Moscow Patriarchate in many areas of Ukraine right now, with bishop's blessing in many cases.
Is there any hope or sense that these actions are anything more than symbolic in terms of not the ability to end the war, but changing Patriarch Kirill's kind of stance on it? Is there a sense, whether it's the Pope or any of these other gestures?
I haven't heard anyone thinking they could change his mind. They may be. What I've heard is more, when the moment of the moral crisis came, essentially what they're saying is we felt let down by our spiritual father, and so there it is. So, yeah.
And just to go back to something you said about kind of Moscow's feeling that it's political, and that now the war is going to take back and reunite the church. It seems to me that this split in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has always kind of sat, or recently anyway, sat at the intersection between religion and politics. And they say, like, you have to, in order to understand religion, you should understand politics, and vice versa. Putin citing the need to save the Orthodox Church as justification for the invasion. But before that, wasn't the push for an independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church out of Kiev fueled at least in part by this desire to signify Ukraine's kind of independence and westward focus?
For sure. Yeah. In fact, the previous president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, was very active in promoting this and helping to engineer this. Recognition of the independent church, and he said as much, that this is part of our project of independence. So yes, now at the same time, he really pushed for it. He came into office after 2014. So that was after the Maidan Revolution, and then Russia responding by taking Crimea, saying this is, as we said earlier, this is our holy ground, and also supporting separatists in the East. So you can see who started that politicization, and, that's in a lot of these disputes, the whole question of who started it is not an easy one to get to the bottom of.
Right. I have a question here. I want to encourage folks. I'm going to run out of questions soon, I promise. And I want to encourage people. There's a Q&A. The chat is not operational, but there's a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. And I want to encourage you, if you have questions for Peter, to please put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that we take a look at them. Sue has said, can you say something about the schism within the Eastern Orthodox Church? It's my understanding that the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church is basically at war with the Patriarch of Constantinople too. I've heard that the church exercises great influence on Mr. Putin. We've talked about that. Is there still a real loggerhead between, I mean, is this a power struggle between Moscow and Constantinople?
There has long been tension there because the Russian Orthodox Church is by far the largest Orthodox church in the world. There are roughly about 200 million Orthodox in the world, which actually makes it the second largest Christian communion after Catholicism. Probably, very roughly, maybe half of them are Russian, but the Ukrainian part is a very, very significant part of that church, and they tend to be even more devout in terms of observance in Ukraine than in the Russian Republic itself. So that either way, though, the Russian church is very large and has a lot of influence that way. And the Patriarch of Constantinople, in contrast, since the fall of the empire, that flock has gotten much smaller. Now, his immediate church in Istanbul is probably tiny in terms of a few thousand people, but he does have jurisdiction over other churches too, including he has ultimate jurisdiction over the Greek Orthodox Church in the United States, as well as a couple other Orthodox churches that, including the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the United States, which formed separately. And so he has some jurisdiction, but it's almost, what he's most prominent for is being the first among equals, whereas the Russian church is the largest and has often sought to assert itself as the real voice of world orthodoxy. So there is a great rivalry there.
And is the Russian Orthodox Church in America the same as the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow, or is it independent?
Therein lies a tale as well. The Russians, in terms of Orthodox history in the United States, the Russians got here first, and they got here by way of Alaska because that was originally a Russian settlement. And for the first, I'd say well into the 19th century, they were the main Orthodox presence here. And then you had the big waves of immigration coming, and that's where you had Greeks and Serbs and Ukrainians and Romanians, etc. And each sort of just formed a bond with their mother church. It's possible that I promise I'm answering the question. It's possible that there could have been one American Orthodox Church formed by the original Russian Orthodox Church that was here. I don't know, but it could have happened. But once 1917 happened, and there was the communist revolution, the Orthodox here were cut off from the Orthodox there. So it was pretty much up to the Orthodox here to develop among themselves. So the church that this was originally the Russian Orthodox Church here over time became more multi-ethnic for a variety of reasons. And eventually, the Russian Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union did have at least some room to maneuver, and eventually they just granted full independence or autocephaly to the American church. Now, not everyone, just like with the Ukrainian church, although with less rancor, not all the other patriarchs agreed to that. So it's one of those ambiguous cases where it's self-governing, but not everyone is recognizing it as completely like among equals. So nevertheless, we have the Orthodox Church in America, which, as I said, is it's independent. It certainly has Russian roots, but other roots as well. It's very multi-ethnic. And, it also has had a fair amount of converts as well, people that never came from any particular ethnic jurisdiction. So when the schism happened, and then I'll get to the war, but when the schism happened, there was a question, well, who's going to honor? So the Moscow says, I'm out of communion with Constantinople, which means, if you filter it down, that would mean anyone, like any Greek Orthodox in the US or Ukrainian Orthodox in the US, wouldn't be welcome for communion at a Russian Orthodox church, or vice versa, in theory. But the Orthodox Church in America is independent of Moscow, and like I said, and it's charted its own path, and it made its decision that any Orthodox who was in a legitimate, canonically recognized Orthodox church were in communion with, and they continue to cooperate with. So this past Sunday was a big date on the Orthodox calendar. It's called Orthodox Sunday, and there's a big service that, at least here in Pittsburgh, again, with the steel mills, we had immigrants from everywhere. So you've got lots of towns around here and neighborhoods where you've got there either are or were steel mills, and then you've got the onion domes right nearby. Lots of Orthodox churches. If you've seen the Deer Hunter, you know what I'm talking about. And they all get together. So on this past Sunday, you had, just by way of analogy, you had a Greek church hosting a service that was led by a bishop of the Orthodox Church in America, where the preaching was done by the Archbishop of the American Carpatho-Rusin Orthodox Church of America. And then there were others as well in the congregation. So they're still cooperating. And, I even asked them, are there any orders out there to deny anyone communion? And the bishops I've spoken to have said, no, it's all we'd ask is, if we don't know you and you show up for communion, we just want to know, did you go to confession recently? So there's that. Now, in addition to the Orthodox Church in America, there is a smaller church. I believe its name is still the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, but it might have had a different name. And there might be some expatriate churches too that answer to the Moscow Patriarchate, and they are honoring that that break of communion. So I don't know to what extent they would actually interview each person coming for communion, but at least in theory, they are agreeing to honor it. So they are a small but significant part of the American Orthodox population. So that's the table to how are they reacting to the war. And statements of the bishops have been pretty strong, across the board, at least in this country, against the war.
Yeah, Travis just asked, have there been any notable public statements from leadership in the various Russian Orthodox churches in America concerning the crisis?
I haven't looked up the Roquefort statement, the church that is still affiliated with Moscow. The Orthodox Church in America, I might even have this on one of my screens. Yeah, they issued it's here somewhere. But anyway, they certainly have made a call for peace in the war, the Orthodox Church in America. And so as there's a group, all the different Orthodox communions cooperate in what's known as the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops of the USA. And they also issued a very strong call for peace. Now, some people might want to parse the words of different churches to say, well, did they sufficiently blame Russia for the war or not? And that can be as well. But I mean, there's obviously nobody that's in favor of it.
Right, right. And so I'm hearing you say that really the Ukrainian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox here in the United States, this has not driven a wedge between them in terms of.
Well, not between the, certainly I have not seen a wedge between them and the Orthodox Church in America. Again, is Russian descended, but has come into its own. I haven't seen so much what their relations are with the actual churches that are still connected with Moscow, but those are fewer. So like there are places like in the town next to mine, there is literally an Orthodox Church in America church right next door to Ukrainian ones. So you got two domes right next to each other, and they get along well, from what I understand.
I want to just briefly talk about the impact of the war on members of other religious faiths in Ukraine. You'd mentioned that there are some religious minorities. Again, all Ukrainian citizens are struggling for their lives right now, quite literally. But in particular, given the history of persecution under Tsars and Soviets, what are the unique concerns of Ukraine's like Catholic, Jewish, and other religious minority communities? Are they even more concerned based on if this doesn't go the right way, what their futures will look like?
Yeah, each one has its own story. The most, probably the most dramatic story is of the Ukrainian Catholics. And as I mentioned earlier, they're distinguished from Roman Catholics in that they're all loyal to the Pope. They're all Catholic, but the Ukrainian Catholics are descended from Orthodox who in, I believe the 16th century, this was during a time of rule under the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, which was Catholic. They reached an agreement with the Vatican to allow them, they came under the authority of the Pope, they accepted Catholic dogma, but they were allowed to keep their own discipline, their own liturgy. They used the same exact Byzantine liturgy. And this is why you hear them referred to as Greek Catholics. It's not an ethnicity, it's their liturgical tradition. It's from the Byzantine tradition. And they get to keep their married priests as well. So if similar question is that if you went into a Byzantine Catholic church, would you notice the difference from an Orthodox service? Not very much. I mean, you'd really have to know your stuff to spot it. I mean, you'd see a picture of the Pope on the wall. That would probably be the most obvious difference. And they're about 10% of the population. Now, the Orthodox have always viewed that as kind of a stealthy way for the Catholics to encroach on their territory, and this goes back to the 1,000-year-old schism. It's like, they broke because the Pope was asserting authority over all Christians. And so when, they reached this agreement with the Ukrainian Catholics, they felt, okay, this is an act of spiritual aggression. And that was also, that carried over into the political realm, so that when the Soviets took over, whereas the Russian Orthodox Church was at least granted limited toleration to practice, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was forced underground. It was basically banned. It was called the largest banned church in the world at the time, which I don't know how you measure underground churches, but it gives you an idea of how significant this was. And they suffered brutal persecution. It's a real church of martyrs. And after communism, they finally, there's also, they feel a real strong, there's just a history of bitterness in that, a feeling that the Russian Orthodox Church kind of was able to take advantage of that situation because they were able to practice, whereas the Catholics were not. So there was some, definitely, I haven't researched this enough to tell you chapter and verse about it, but there certainly are a lot of very, very hard feelings about that. So after independence, the church was allowed to come out from the catacombs, so to speak, and it thrived. It was an amazing kind of post-Cold War success story, and the church just bloomed. So clearly those who were waiting for the church to come back out from under the catacombs again, they were more than ready to join. So it's a thriving church right now. And given the history, they are especially wary of ever coming under the control of Moscow again. So they're very highly respected in Ukraine. They were very much active in the Maidan Revolution as well, cooperating a lot with the Orthodox. So that's their story. They're mostly in the West, which has to date been the least contested part in the war, but still very, from what I'm told by Ukrainian Catholics here, they are more than ready to take up defense, whether it's, if it's under occupation as an insurgency or what. They just do not want to go under Soviet or Moscow's domination again. The Jewish population has an incredibly rich history as well in Ukraine. In fact, some very holy sites in the Hasidic movement are there because it was there during a particularly bleak time in Jewish history. It's a very complex relationship because there were terrible pogroms in Ukraine committed by Cossacks who were frankly fighting for Ukrainian independence and turned on the medieval Jewish communities, seeing them as collaborators with foreign occupiers. So that's a very, very bitter part of their history, but they also have many sages and rabbis who, particularly in the Hasidic movement, who kind of led to a real revival in Judaism. And I've even had one scholar tell me, you wouldn't have Judaism as it is today without the Judaism that emerged from Ukraine. So there are graves of sages and all that are still there. And then, of course, you have the Holocaust, which terribly wiped out a huge proportion of Ukraine's Jewish population. And in fact, there's a shrine in Kiev to a terrible massacre that took place where some very high number of people were killed within 2 days. And that shrine was actually damaged in a Russian air raid, according to the Ukrainians. There's a Muslim minority as well. And from what I have read, I've not reported on this myself, that this is a Tatar minority that was more based in Crimea, and some have left Crimea because they felt persecuted under the Russian occupation there. Various Protestant groups as well. All of these have thrived, by the way, in an independent Ukraine. There's been a real religious diversity and a real religious flowering. They are, like the Baptists and Pentecostals, they've been very active in trying to arrange for refugee aid and all, and they all consider themselves Ukrainians, and they're all in the same boat in this sense.
So, it's interesting, and John asked the question I was going to ask as well, which is, some of this seems, ironic isn't the right word because it's just too tragic what's going on, but he basically asked, kind of given that for decades Russia was secular, like anti-religious society, right? Soviet Union was anti-religious. He asked, where does Putin stand in terms of observing and promoting religion based on his long history as a Soviet, where it was just a secular society?
Well, from the experts that I've talked to, he has increasingly made very public identifications with Orthodoxy. So talking about how his grandmother baptized him, which apparently was a thing people would do maybe more clandestinely. I believe he'll attend major, like an Easter service. He may wear a cross, if I'm not mistaken, at least some of the time. So yeah, he is increasingly identified not only personally with the church, but also identified the church as like essential to the soul of Russia. Yeah, and
You mentioned.
yes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, just yes. Given the history of Soviet repression of religion, that is ironic.
So you mentioned the 1.2, 1.6 million Jews who were killed during the Holocaust in Ukraine, and you talked about the memorial that was damaged. You recently wrote a story about other landmark shrines that are significant religiously and culturally to both, schisms, or not schisms, that's not the right word, but both kind of groups of the Orthodox Church. Is there anything currently being done to protect those sites? And what's the status of them at this point?
Yeah, there are shrines going back. There's a cathedral, St. Sophia's, that its oldest parts date back 1,000 years. There are murals and mosaics that date back about that time, and a monastery of the caves, which is nearby, which literally there are these underground catacomb monastic cells and all, and then other church buildings and things have been built on them. So they are held very sacred, not only by both branches of Orthodoxy in Ukraine, but also by Catholics who, they trace their roots back to the beginning as well. And there are other buildings, some of them ancient or medieval, some of them built or rebuilt after the Soviets tore them down. I have not heard, since I wrote that article, I haven't heard of any damage to them per se, but there was a cathedral in Kharkiv, if I'm pronouncing it right, that was damaged in a blast. It didn't hit the cathedral, but the shock of it damaged it. Mm-hmm. And it would be, at this point, who knows what is sacred to that, given what else is being attacked. But given that this is, it would be especially, well, right now, St. Sophia's and the Monastery of the Caves, they're part of the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So you can't imagine them targeting it per se, but at this point in the war, who knows? They target the other churches more. And, even if they're not targeting them, you've got a densely populated city. It's kind of hard to, it's not hard to miss and hit the thing you're not trying to hit.
Well, we're just about out of time, and you have been incredibly gracious with your knowledge and your time and your expertise. And I know you specifically said that, you are a reporter, so you're not here to speculate. So I'm going to try not to put you on the spot, but ask you that based on your reporting, do you get the sense that both Orthodox churches can survive in Ukraine now that the conflict has taken place?
Yeah, I think that no one is really thinking about that right now. I mean, if Ukraine is somehow able to maintain its independence, I think they'll sort it out. Mm-hmm. If more territory permanently becomes under Russian control, in that case, I'm not sure who's not going to have a hard time, because it's hard to imagine there being much forbearance for the independent church. But on the other hand, the clergy and the bishops who have stopped commemorating the patriarch, who've denounced the war, what is it going to be like for them? If they pretty much sealed their fate too in a Russian occupied area. So it's hard to know, but other than that, from the experience that we've heard from, say, from Crimea, comparing that to the religious toleration that Ukraine has had, it's hard not to imagine that there will be some changes there. We'll just have to monitor them.
Right. Well, and let's just all hope that this comes to an end sooner with as little additional damage as possible. Peter, I cannot thank you enough for joining us. It's been wonderful. You have such a rich history of reporting. I'm hopeful that you'll come back and talk to us again at some point. And in the meantime, just thanks so much for your time.
Good to be here.
Great. Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you to everyone who's been with us this evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.